Romans chapter 9 really begins once we start hitting verse 6. That's where a lot of the questions start coming from. Verse 6 says, "But it is not as though the word of God has failed, for not all who descended from Israel belong to Israel." This idea of lineage, as there in the church in Rome, we continue to have that conversation between the Jews and the Gentiles, those who are connected with lineage and tradition to folks like Abraham, or those who are new to the party like the Gentiles. So Abraham, that Paul writes about, we find in Genesis 17, the covenant between he and God, where God tells him that this covenant will be between, to Abraham, you and your offspring, to where this lineage conversation goes back to. But we look at Abraham's offspring, and his first son is Ishmael, that he has not with Sarah, but before Sarah got pregnant, he had with Hagar, his Egyptian wife. And so we find, though, Isaac is the one that Abraham is told, this is where the promise will go through the name of Isaac, not the firstborn, but the one that was born of promise. And so even in the beginning of the lineage of Abraham, it goes back to the children of promise and not of the children of flesh. And so people like the Gentiles, those that are new to the party, those that were adopted into this, the question here is adoption any less valid? Absolutely, by no means is it less valid that through the children of promise that they are equal, not as if children of the flesh. And so this discussion of the flesh, of the promise, the firstborn, the otherborn, continues on even with Jacob and Esau, because Esau was the firstborn, not Jacob. Jacob was the one hanging on to the heel of Esau, but he was the secondborn, not the firstborn, as in Jewish lineage tradition. And so as these brothers came about, we find in Malachi chapter 1 that Paul is writing here of Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. And I'll let your group talk about that conversation a little bit. But the firstborn, who was in the lineage of Abraham, is the one that God said I hated. But the secondborn, also in the lineage, saying he is the one I love. That just because the Jews came to the party first, it doesn't make them any more spiritual or any more special. It's just like the conversation we find with James and John and their mother in Matthew chapter 20. She came before Jesus and he said, "What do you want?" And she said to him, "Say that these two sons of mine are to sit one at your right hand and one at your left hand in the kingdom." This mom wanting to say, make my two boys the most special. And so that's what those who are connected in with the lineage of Abraham are saying, but this promise is for us, not for them. And Paul is continuing to reveal that they've got it all wrong, that from the very beginning of Abraham, it is not necessarily of the lineage, the genetic offspring, but the offspring of promise. And that offspring of promise is the ones that you and I are living within. He uses Pharaoh then also, quoting from Exodus 9:16, the plague of hell. And Paul writes, referencing that, "For this very purpose I have raised you up, Pharaoh, that I might show my power in you, and that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth." And so through all of this, as Paul is referencing how all of the Old Testament history came about, that it is all for the glory of God. That it's not necessarily genetic, but it is all this promise of the glory of God and that He will work all things out for His good. So as you get ready to go through these questions, through all of this discussion back and forth, Jew, Gentile, new, old, whether you're new to the party, whether you're late to the party, whether you're just stepping in the door to the party of faith, my challenge for you is don't be complacent and don't be comfortable. Because we are to live in the promise of who we are and who we are becoming, and not in the comfort of old. For when we find ourselves in the comfort of old, just like at the end of Romans chapter 9, he says, we find that stumbling block of works. When we live in the old, we look over our shoulder at our baptism and say, oh, we're good, we've done that. We look at who we were and we don't worry about the promise of now and the promise to come. And so my challenge is, as you sort some of this out in your group, my warning is don't be complacent and don't be comfortable. Blessings upon your discussion.